Welcome back, everybody, to On the Polis. My name is Divisiveness, and I'm very happy to be back with Harivilasa Prabhu. And we have two Premanandas. We have Premananda Vilas and Premananda Kirtan. And they're both here today because they're happy people, individually well situated in their lives. And we're going to be discussing today the importance of social stratification. And especially when it's related to Vedic culture, social stratification usually takes on a negative context in the caste system, etc. And with good reason, that's viewed in a negative way. And we're going to get into that discussion somewhat. But the real hope of today's conversation is to bring out the power of social structure for helping individuals recognize their own potential to bring value, not only into the lives of others, but their own experience of themselves and how that develops spiritually. So I'm really happy to have our guests with us today. Welcome, guys. So I wanted to get right into it. I'll start with Premananda Kirtan. He's somebody who is happily situated as an academic, and he's done the hard work. He's just this close to finishing his PhD, and he already has a dream job.
You got the Premanandas mixed up, Deva. This is Premananda Vilas.
Oh, wait. Alrighty. That didn't take long at all. I'm nervous about this only. Premananda Vilas. Premananda Vilas is this close to his PhD, and he's already got a dream job as a curator at the Smithsonian. So I wanted to hear from you, Premananda Vilas. How did you figure out that you wanted to do all that work to go into academia and then to remain there? And how does that relate also to your spiritual practice? What has that informed you about developing that sense of what you want to be in the world?
Thanks, Deva. Thanks for having me. Love you guys. Great follower of this show. So super excited to be on. I think what I'll say is that my arrival to this place that I'm at, having made the decision 6 years ago now to enter graduate school and pursue this path of a lot of frankly, like really serious hard work, very individual, very monastic in a large sense, because you're focused on this one individual topic, and it's just you. You're not really working on a team. You are focusing on something that hopefully you're really interested in, and you're taking it to its end. You're trying to become an expert on something. So it wasn't a straightforward path for me. Neither of my parents had, gotten their PhDs or anything like that. I remember starting off after high school, going to engineering school because that's what my dad did. I didn't really know any better. And my dad was like, okay, you should just do this. And I thought, okay, well, that's what I'll do.
That's what we do.
Yeah, that's what we do. And I think that has some connections to, the caste system, if we want to talk about that, because so many of us end up doing what our parents did or our family does. But before jumping into all of that, back to the story. So I was doing my engineering, and I thought, this is something that's going to, at the least, be like a security net, something that I can fall back on and make some money and, live a comfortable life. Graduated, got a job, and realized very quickly I couldn't do this forever. I realized that this wasn't me at the heart of it. It's something that I was reasonably good at, but I definitely didn't feel like I could do this for 50 years and then retire and look back at my life and think, wow, I did something that I really wanted to. No, that wasn't where I was at. And so I thought back on what I truly enjoyed, and I realized it was teaching and communicating, and thinking about ideas on a sort of macro level, on a sort of bird's eye level, and so decided to pursue a PhD in history, which I am, as you stated, wrapping up next month.
Hey.
My dissertation, and hopefully from there on be a doctor of philosophy. Oh, well, in this case, of history. Yeah.
Wonderful. That we'll have to have you back when you're an official doctor. That way we can have our first doctor on the show.
Happy to fulfill that.
And Premananda Kirtan, you're situated as a monk, officially, so to speak, and you're also a really well-known musician. And you, how did you get settled into that? What gave you that sense that this is where you can stay and feel comfortable with yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. Very privileged and honored to be with all of you. Yeah, music was a large part of my life since as long as I can remember. You know, I think I was about 9 or 10 when I kind of had that mystical experience of being able to play what I heard. And my parents were quite supportive. And so as I finished school, I went to study music and studied jazz, piano, and trumpet specifically. And I had a very strong connection with the music and my spiritual aspirations. I really found that my journey and relationship with God was in my music. But then as I came to know of Bhakti, and I found that there was something more to the music, actually. I went on a different path, and even to the point where I felt like I needed to leave or renounce my music, you know, and I had an attempt at a monastic life around about my second year of college, where I thought to leave, you know, music school and join a temple. But my dad wasn't so keen on that idea, and I couldn't run away 20 minutes down the road. So what ended up happening is I finished the degree, and then I went to India on a pilgrimage experience and went to many places to get some ashram life. And I really thought, looking back at it, I really thought that I wasn't going to, you know, be playing piano and trumpet much anymore. I thought, you know, it's all about distributing books, eating wood for breakfast, and being renounced and austere. Then I met my spiritual master, and I must say that there was a significant shift as he introduced an idea of surrender that I wasn't actually completely you know, aware of, and he started to engage my musical abilities. And it started off, you know, assisting him with his kirtans and his musical presentations of the festivals that happen in Poland. But over the years, I found more and more involvement and responsibility came my way, to the point of managing the stage show, and then even creating theaters and soundtracks. And now an entire career, I could say, has been kind of engaged in this service. And I feel very satisfied, even on a professional level, being able to have contributed in this way. And now at this point, I feel very much connected, you know, on that existential level, and also just on a musical level, to feel like I'm still making that contribution that, you know, my college professors, you know, they can accept to some degree. And now I'm at that point, you know, in life where obviously feeling that responsibility now with the spiritual master's mission in the performing arts, and finding my own you know, voice and creativity in that way. So that's where I'm at now.
Beautiful. It sounds like you both had you left what you liked and then you came back to it.
And you know, Deva, if you don't mind me adding a little bit, I think part of that journey is, at least for me, was also constantly hearing in the Gita, which I've been reading since college, since my college days, a little earlier, this search for Dharma, the search for my Dharma, right? The first word of the Gita, Dharma, Dharma Kshetra. And I knew that until I had found something that I could truly live out in a satisfied way in my life, I wouldn't be happy offering that life to the divine, to God, to Krishna. Because I didn't want to, if I was miserable, what would I be offering?
Yeah, well said. I wanted to ask Harivilasa, Prabhu, because he kind of initiated this conversation. And what you just said, Premananda, it's not unique, we could say, to the Vedic ideal or the Bhakti community. Like, I want to live a life that makes me happy. And how everyone has that idea or that sense, and yet how many are actually able to do that? And what is society's role in creating a context where that's possible for people? I think that's what the heart of what we're hoping to speak to tonight. So I wanted to ask Harivilasa what he saw in that dynamic of how the individual, who's ultimately the person that's supposed to be attaining that happiness, how that plays into the individual being a part of a larger community, a society even, because there seems to be some natural tension there. The considerations of the society, the expectations of even my parents, what to speak of others within the society, somehow getting in the way of my individuation.
Yeah, that's the question. The question of the individual and society and their relationship, which I think is what this discussion is about. And specifically, if you want to approach the political realm from the spiritual perspective, it's always very interesting because spirituality, transcendence, ultimately is such an individual experience versus then the political is about the society. And the two things are in one sense opposed. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, it's fascinating if we would go look at that, how you get this almost like two layers of instructions. You get the societal kind of instructions about society and dharma, and at the same time you get these instructions that is directed to the transcendentalists, which is all about abandoning your connections. And it's like, how does that all work together? And I think for me, the big discussion, what makes it very relevant, sort of when I really started to think about it, was the first, I mean, trying to figure out your own life. We all know that experience, but really when it really starts to hit you, this understanding of how the individual is in one sense dependent on the societal, even for his own individual, for being able to find his individual position, is the moment that you start building spiritual community. In the beginning, it's very individual, like it's basically about connecting to a spiritual process, and we've all had this experience. Myself and Premananda Kirtan, we were together 10 years basically in South Africa.
Wow.
To a large part, most of our work there going towards building a certain community there. And it was very interesting because then people come and they connect with the spiritual process. And if everybody's monastic, it's very easy, you know, you just join the monastery and then it's like problem solved. You know, what do you need? You just shave off your head, the clothes, and you know, you're individual. But then with time, you realize, listen, not everybody's going to do that. And immediately you have this problem on your hands because now you have people, they're connecting to a spiritual process, but they also need an identity. Yeah, they need some kind of identity with which they have to function. And with that identity, they also need to have that, because they need to know what are they supposed to do, what are their duties, what are their obligations, and on that basis they have to make these decisions. So, and then we see that identity, to a large part, you cannot just construct it yourself. You cannot just be self-generate an identity. That identity is always going to be in conjunction with other people. And immediately then you have the issue on your hands of how you're going to help people find their place within a society, whether it's now even just a small community, a spiritual community, and then also finding their place in the world. And then it is then, if you understand that it's not as, if you understand that the simple solution that everybody should just do what they want doesn't really work. Look and you turn and you look at what the traditional world, not just the Vedic world, any ancient society, any pre-modern culture, really, any traditional culture, and you look at how they dealt with it, and then you see, wow, very interesting. You know, you see how the ancient world, they also sat with the same problem and they approach it in a little different way. So that's sort of, you know, this discussion, looking at the ancient world and looking at the modern world and seeing how we are sitting with the same issues, but we're trying to solve it with different methods to varying degrees of success.
Yeah.
So that was the basic genesis of, at least for myself, in trying to approach this topic, trying to understand how it all supposed to fit together.
You're sharing, there's an imagery that I have for myself when I consider this issue, which I wake up every morning with a little bit, at least, if not a lot, of existential dread. And this is one of the issues that brings that, is, you know, who am I in this larger context, and what do I really matter? And I don't think I'm alone in that. And I always think about a puzzle piece. You guys ever done puzzles, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 pieces in some cases? And if I'm just holding that one little puzzle piece in my hand and there's no other piece on the board, it's impossible for me to put that piece in the right place. As more pieces, though, are in place on the board, the easier it is for me to pick up any other individual piece and know, oh, this is where it fits. This is where it goes. And I was wondering, so I want to turn it back to Prem Kirtan and ask, what was your experience of the tension between your own sense of what you should be doing and that of which others thought you should be doing? Parents, teachers, professors, society in general. Was any of that input helpful? And how did it jive with your own internal dynamic, what you were sensing needed to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting question. I can, there's two levels to that. I can definitely say, coming from a music background and being in association with musicians, there's one level of that pressure that one faces, and then obviously in relationship to the spiritual practice. When I first started college, there were about 12 jazz piano performer players, right? People that were signed up to play jazz piano specifically in performance. And when I graduated, there was only one, and that was me. So that meant that people either realize that they're not gonna make it as musicians, or they're not gonna make money as musicians, or they don't have the it factor, etc., etc. Regardless what it is, there's that one aspect that people will be facing, and then I looked at, before even getting to the spiritual level, I just look at what the people that did endure those years and were capable of continuing with their music. I see that when there is an alignment with one's dharma, with that thing that you're supposed to do, a sense of detachment follows. A sense of ability to accept, your circumstances, and definitely also in challenge of what society or other kind of external pressures may be there. And I can certainly vouch for that. When it comes to the creative process and dealing with many artists, especially because I have been responsible for cultivating artists and helping them along their journey, and especially staying in the ring of the creative field, and especially those who are pursuing it as a professional career. And I can see that when there is that sense of connection to understanding that this is the thing that I'm supposed to do in this world, it's almost like an ability to accept, and also an auspiciousness flows from that. And when obviously, if you have the privilege of aligning that with a higher purpose when it comes to serving God and your spiritual values, I think it has even stronger place. So for myself, I definitely, I had this nature, and I thought, and then I had the spiritual kind of pursuit, and then I thought that, the spiritual, I had this idea of what spirituality was. And I thought it was renunciation, actually, at that point of my life. But it took a person really to show me that I can approach this differently, especially in the long run. That I can be grateful now that on a sustainable level of Krishna consciousness and my kind of dharma, that I was able to connect it to my to my spiritual kind of aspirations, you could say, to the point that I was given the name Premananda Kirtan Das. So like this Kirtan Das is in my
it's
like
baked
kind of
in.
purpose. Yeah, every day I wake up, and I think so. I know that we may not all have the fortune of having that situation in our lives where we're all going to be able to be musicians and travel with the Swamis. But I think that it's not necessarily that everybody wants that as well. And I think that it's a mistake to think that that's the level in isolation. Whereas I've seen people who are very peaceful and satisfied doing what they're doing, and also the people who contribute to the to the movement in these ways that are connecting to what's natural for them. So I have found that you're able to accept your circumstances when you're doing what you're meant to do, and certainly you can, when you connect yourself with any divine will, your ability to perceive the Krishna factor and understand that these are all organized or ordained by a higher script, allows you to traverse those circumstances much more manageably. That's what I would say.
I'm hearing something there. There's an irony, and I love how you brought that out, that there's a natural detachment that comes, a healthy sense of renunciation automatically when you're satisfied in what you're doing. That you can do that whether anyone else is happy or seeing it or acknowledging it or not. And that creates a healthy mental experience. But then also you're pointing out yourself, you've been in this kind of ashram existence for a long time now. And that's how you came into your recognition of being a musician, through that connection with your teacher. But there was this kind of trope or stereotype of the way you should do things, even within that kind of idealized culture, which in some ways was blocking you from recognizing that.
Mm.
And earlier, Premananda Vilas, you had said you were also kind of just entering into a trope. I'm just going to be an engineer because that's what dad did, and that's what seems to, you know, make money and keep you safe and successful. So how did you maybe discuss that tension for yourself? What did the society around you do or not do for you in terms of recognizing where you are ultimately as an academic? Because when you go to your, I'm sure you went to your father and said, I want to be a history professor. And it's like, what do you, why history? Yeah. Why not anything else? Why history?
I'm so sure that if as an undergrad I had decided to pursue history as a major, my parents would have been shocked. But, you know, once I already had that engineering to fall back on, they were like, okay, go do whatever you want. So that was my ticket with them. I think, you know, this, going back to something Harivilasa was also saying, you know, to an extent, we need to know where we want to go, what the options are. We need to be sort of directed and towards avenues that suit our sort of psychophysical makeup. You need teachers for that. You need people who really know you and who have the capacity and the foresight and the wisdom to be able to direct you and guide you towards something that really fits your proclivities, things that you're good at. But also, I think it really requires some introspection. And I think this is at least what I've learned that's been so key to my own journey, because it was so easy to just go along with what everyone else was saying. It was so easy to just assume that, okay, you know, if I stick to engineering or if I stick to, you know, a business degree or something like that, I'll be fine. It requires so little introspection, so little imagination, frankly, so little effort to just keep the ball rolling or roll down that hill with the momentum that society seems to be driving towards a particular destination. But I think the key for us, especially now that most people are directed in those directions, yet our capacities may be so different, it's so key for us to stop and really consider our dharma in relationship with our abilities and in relationship with the guidance of like teachers and mentors. That's definitely stood out to me as being the way I've managed to find myself in a place where I truly am happy doing what I'm doing. And that's where the detachment comes from, because it doesn't matter what the result is. I'm happy doing it.
Beautiful. So you both brought up this element of teachers and mentors, and I think that kind of structure, we can say, that helps you give that context. And I'd like to go to you, Harivilasa Prabhu, because you said something, Prem Vilas, that you need options. You need to have some sense of what's possible. And the postmodern approach is that everything is possible. That's what many people hear growing up. And when I was going to school, you can be whatever you want to be. And I remember, you know, being surrounded by a lot of people that wanted to be the next Michael Jordan in the literal sense. Like, it's a kind of trope in itself. But the school I grew up in, everybody thought they were going to be the next Michael Jordan, until at some point they realized they weren't. And then everything just fell off a cliff. Their whole sense of drive and initiative and purpose in life was just gone. And they fell into a bunch of things that were very unbecoming. So there's a tension there, Harivilasa Prabhu. I'd like you to speak on it. Everything's an option, or this maybe the rigid kind of trope of the caste system. You only have one option. Your dad's an engineer, you're going to be an engineer. My dad was a brick mason, I'm going to be a brick mason. Nowhere else, nothing else but that. Where is the harmony between these two things, which don't actually seem to be creating a healthy atmosphere for anybody on either extreme?
Well, I find it interesting, Prem Vilas was speaking about, you see, this is also something that you experience when you start having to help guide people, that you realize that we're not so good actually at knowing what we're supposed to do. It's embarrassing, actually, to have to see people, and sometimes you meet people and they become dead set on a certain idea, and everybody can see clearly that this is not going to work. You know? It's not a good idea. So, and what I also find interesting is if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, for example, you see that there's two verses that are repeated in the whole book. There's only two verses that are said twice, more or less the same. So the one is very famous verse, Man Mana Bhavamat Bhakto, more or less repeated. So that the central core message of the Bhagavad Gita, just worship God, offer your obeisances to Him, and everything will be fine, basically. And the other one that Krishna repeats says, be very careful about doing someone else's duty. It's very dangerous. He says it twice. and over the years, I've seen, actually for myself, it's like a principle I fall back on again, because I realize I do it again and again. Like, and the reason why we do it is because there's a few reasons. We see that the motivation behind choosing what you're supposed to do, that is not clear. So the moment you make a decision, for example, based on financial security or financial compensation, then you're going on the wrong road to know what you're supposed to be doing, because it just doesn't work like that. You don't actually, you're not going to know if that becomes the main predominating factor. The chances of you doing something you like is very rare. And also, like you're saying, the tension is on the one hand, if you dream it, you can do it. That is bogus. You can't. Like, I remember once I was reading about the founder of the WeWork. I don't know if you know. Very famous company, but the guy had a total collapse. Basically the whole started out was a very bad end, and he became a megalomaniac. Basically, he was intoxicated with his own success, and at a certain point he said, "I will become the next president of the United States." He said that's what he wanted to become. And then someone told him, he says, "Listen, dude, you were born in Israel. Like you're not born in America. You can't become the American president." And like, well, then I'll become the president of the planet. So just this, and then what ended up with him total disaster. His whole thing collapsed because of not properly followed principles of ethics. So the reality is that no, if you dream it, it's not just because you dream it, you can do it. Maybe in a very big scheme, from a reincarnation perspective, technically it is possible.
Good point.
But at least in this life, to understand that one is constrained. Now the question is, what is those constraints? And I think then we go to the other extent, to understand that you're also not necessarily as constrained as you think you are. In terms of, you're not constrained necessarily, at least in the modern world, so much by tradition. We can see you can become whatever you want to. It's like, sort of, the big constraint in the modern world is money. That's the actual big constraint. And it's a very powerful constraint. And something actually people need to take into account. That if you don't have money for something, then it's not really an option. It's just, you have to just have that, just understand that that's a reality.
Yeah, it's a society to recognize.
It's very interesting. You see how people rack up this massive student debt. Whereas the other option is you can just be like, well, I mean, if I can't afford it, then maybe I shouldn't do it. Like that's just another way of thinking, instead of getting yourself in very complicated situations. But the real thing that we see, at least in Vedic tradition, what is the thing that constrains you? That's the question. We can't do anything, but we're not necessarily constrained to being exactly what our parents were. So, but what is the thing that constrains us? And the thing that constrains us is a certain kind of functional thing. It's like your psychophysical makeup is functionally, there's a functional constraint in terms of what it is sort of pleasurable to do with your mind and body. And what we see, that is the real principle when we speak about dharma. It's just, there's something, if you do that, then at the end what will happen is you will sort of be satisfied. And we see that the big risk, I thought about it for many years. I'm still thinking about, why is it that Krishna says it's so dangerous to do someone else's duty, even if you do the duty perfectly? Like, why is it so dangerous? And there's so many reasons why it's so dangerous, but the one thing that makes it so dangerous is that the one danger is that if you will end up with an occupation that you are not functionally suited for, just like if you use a flute to beat a drum, if you're not going to blow and use it, it's like you're not using it for what it's supposed to be used. Functionally, it's not meant for that. Then what will happen is you will generate an intense amount of frustration in your actual occupation, and then you have to counterbalance that with serious sensual indulgence. That's the way you counterbalance it. And that we see many people, you get really drunk, you do lots of drugs, because you build up all this hatred for
drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
Exactly. So you hate your work, and then you have to do something else to counterbalance that. And therefore we see that that's going to be very difficult. And the other sense what also happens is, the other risk is that you also sell yourself short. So that is an interesting principle we also see, at least in spiritual life, that people sometimes take the easy route. they take a position or a dharma or a certain occupation that is actually unchallenging, unstimulating, that leaves their resources untapped. And that also generates a massive sense of
Frustration.
frustration and feeling a lack of meaning, feeling unchallenged. And then that also has to be counterbalanced. And what I find interesting, there's a nice verse in the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita where it is explained the different kinds of workers, the different workers in the different modes of nature. And the worker in the mode of goodness naturally is a person who simply does his duty. And that duty is very interesting because it means that if you are bold with a certain kind of talent or propensity, you are in one sense duty bound to engage that. Otherwise, it will irk you and it will cause problems. If you have a certain talent and ability that is not tapped, and if you look at the description of the worker in the mode of ignorance, there's one word shata, which is translated as deceit. And then in one of the commentators, what's his name, Baladev Vidyabhushana, he writes in his comment, he says, what is that deceit? He said, it is a person who hides his abilities. If you hide your abilities, then you will become covered over by ignorance. And we see that in the modern world also. People who have a much larger capacity to do things for society, but they just don't, because out of laziness or out of whatever it is, they're just out of comfort also, because if you avoid challenge because you want to be comfortable. And that also leads you onto a disastrous path. Because the irony is, and this is very fascinating, and we see also that as a prerequisite for being able to practice spiritual life, you have to be peaceful. But that peace is different for different people. Some people, like my father, he was a soldier for many years, and he fought in a war, and they were on the border of Angola fighting for many years. And I asked him once, I said, how was it to be there? Like, how was it to be at war for so many years?
He was happy.
He said it was the best time of his life. So he was peaceful, actually. Under high pressure circumstances, some people they need that to be peaceful and focused. And it's like, when it's a matter of life and death, they just flourish. I met a friend today. Someone recently, he works in New York City. He's one of these guys that they lay.
Hold on, I'm gonna cut you off because
Sure.
I want to hear, before we leave the point, I want to hear from these guys. It's an interesting question you posed, which is, what's the danger in doing someone else's duty? Is actually essentially how we set up the whole idea of who you should become. Who has the prettiest girl, who has the most money, who drives the fastest car. I want to do what they do to get what they have. And as you said, in chasing money or chasing some external experience, we often sell ourselves short. So Prem Kirtan, how about we start with you? What's the danger in that kind of externalization of what I ought to become, doing someone else's duty, so to speak?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I think Harivilasa covered some really nice points there. I'll just add one thing that I can say is interesting to me, is that if you do, because it specifically says another's duty perfectly, right? And what we see, what comes after that is pride, actually, and that sense of false pride, really, because it's false pride will be the cause of many complications after. Because I can say, from those people whom I know that are aligned with their duty and their dharma, that there's always a humility that comes with that. That especially I could speak from the arts world, that people who are born to do that, there's like they don't claim or they don't possess the success and the glory and the fame that comes with it, because it's not the thing that they're after. It's not the thing that they're looking at. They're looking at something else. And I think that seeing it from that perspective, because you're not actually you're not in tune with that activity itself. You're chasing the results, the outcome, the externals, or some other aspect of it rather than the activity. Whereas those who are connected to the activity, they have a sense of humility and a sense of never feeling. I mean, this is in my experience, feeling like I have to be doing this just because I have to be doing it, not because it's something else that has to become validated. So I would say the aspect of pride and what that brings about from material, to the spiritual level, it becomes complicated, because the individual then is subject to being I wouldn't say insincere, but but their integrity is challenged, because they're doing something for another reason, even though externally it looks fine. And why we find that difficult is because people will tell you, or society will tell you, that this is okay, or this is what it should be, and you're getting affirmations for that all the way to a point in your life where I would say something like a midlife crisis is embodying that, where you can't carry it on anymore, even though it's supposed to be successful. And then there's a certain collapse. So that's what I would contribute to that point.
Amazing point. Thank you. And how about you, Premananda Vilas?
Yeah, thanks, Deva.
What's the danger of doing someone else's duty? Because that caveat also, even if you do it perfectly, Krishna, even if it looks great and you're doing it really well, you still shouldn't do it.
But here's the thing. I think despite Krishna saying that, chances are you're not going to do it perfectly. Chances are you're not just going to mess up your own life, but you're going to mess up the lives of all the people that depend on you and society at large. We are seeing this kind of dysfunction so poignantly in society right now. We have, people who are only interested in making money in the positions of leadership and in the positions of power. We are seeing, people who should be, taking some kind of laid back sort of job in very high stress situations, and then they end up committing suicide. And I mean, the whole dysfunction of the social order is part of this, because when we're each doing our own thing, then there is a kind of harmony in society. I love the example of the finger on your hand. Its only purpose is served when it's on the hand. But if you put a finger on your head, it's not going to do anything. And I think it's also why in the Varnashram system, the image of Vishnu's body is used, because they work together when they're in their place. But when they're not, then everything gets screwed up.
That's great. For those unfamiliar with that imagery, there's this comparison in the Vedic literature to a healthy social body being the literal body of God. And there's these 4 divisions of that labor, which are natural and present in any society. And when they're harmonized, the legs, the stomach, the arms, and then the head, then every appendage is happy being a part of that harmony. And to your point, when one is off or one is not in the right place, then everyone else is unhappy also. And
exactly.
So it brings in this interesting tension. Harivilasa Prabhu, maybe you can speak to this, because you mentioned the money point, which is an essential concern, as you said. And there is this apparently unavoidable stratification of resources that happens across the divisions of labor. And that's one of the real pain points in my vision of why people reject this idea of a kind of social class culture, is because some people are going to have more money and some people are not. And that upsets everyone, or at least those that are the have-nots, especially when the ideal or the idea of success in society is to have that money. So how do you reconcile that if your nature is on the low end of the financial totem pole, for lack of a better word?
Well, that's interesting. Firstly, what we can say is that even if you take a relatively simple occupation, quote unquote, specifically when you think about compensation for work, there's general trends, the average lawyer makes this amount of money and the average carpenter makes this amount of money. But then when you look at a very good carpenter, someone who really knows what he's doing, that can actually make quite a lot of money. I mean, there's actually quite a few, the variability, even in specific occupations, a lot on the quality of work that a person does. And naturally, if you're the best carpenter in the world, you're not going to make as much money as the best lawyer in the world. That's balanced out. But who is it? Was it Sam Malouf? Sam Malouf, very famous American woodworker, and he charges about $30,000 to $40,000 for one chair. So the point being that if one, private, specifically in the Vedic tradition, is also just the reality of karma, that it's not really so much purely choosing an occupation in a certain line that will guarantee you some sort of financial breakthrough. And the reality, rather, that is recommended is, listen, if you're going to love what you do, if you're going to take a route, take a direction route where you're going to be able to do something that is in harmony with your conditioning, in the end, it will end up better. But it is a fact, and that's just the price you have to pay. Just like we would say, ending up in an occupation you hate just for money, that's also, you sell out.
Yeah, you sold out.
Other option is you can pay the price the other way, and you can be like, listen, I'm going to rather do what I like, and I'm just going to have less money. And I think that I that's why I think also spiritual organization, specifically something like the Varnashram system or social organization, it only really works when there is that element of spirituality. Otherwise, you're never going to have people plug in the right places where it's good for them, because the moment you start chasing the fruits of the labor, then you won't be able to make that right decision. And it is just, you can choose either way. And there's tons of examples of people who did that, who made a lot of money in a field, and then at a certain point they're like, I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to do what I like. And then they see that the result is ultimately better. Now, the other thing is also, sometimes we also have to point that out. Some people, it's not that all occupations are also necessarily pleasant. And that also just is there, that something we can also has to be said. Now, when you look at this stuff, there's a kind of a myth, the myth that your occupation is somehow going to be the thing that will provide you all the meaning in your life. And I think that also, if you have that idea, also complicates things, because then you also sometimes expect too much of your occupation. You have too high expectations of what your job is supposed to give you. And then you're thinking that the job becomes the central part of your identity, which is a myth that was created to convince people to do very intense work that's very unpleasant.
For a long time.
Also, that has to be adjusted, because generally in the modern world, you get a lot of money for work that either requires very specialized skills or just sometimes work that is extremely unpleasant. And if it's not going to pay you tons of money, no one is going to do it.
Yeah, great points. And maybe that's a nice segue into as Premananda Vilas mentioned before we got on live, the kind of elephant in the room of the caste system. And that's always how I conceive of the caste system in India as it became expressed, was the removal of the spiritual value. And when that spiritual value is pulled away, then you just have a system, a material system like any other, to control and exploit people, maintain power for some and keep it away from others. And with that healthy egalitarian spiritual potential that anybody within any sphere of the society has the potential to achieve the ultimate success, then there's a sense of satisfaction that can come to the guy who has to sweep the street or to clean out the sewer and watch the lawyers walk by him his whole life. There's still a sense that my life can have value. And that's where taking away that value, taking away that sense of possibility from the common man and most men, that was done through the caste system's uglier expressions, is for me what created and creates all of the pain that we see in it. But I wanted to ask and put this one to Premananda Vilas first. What do you see as the ire of the caste system? Where does that folly come in? And how can, if any way, how can we steer ourselves out of that or away from that?
Yeah. Thanks, Eva. I think Harivilasa is right on that. Without like a spiritual vision or spiritual goals, basically you need to have ashram and varna. That's why it's called varnashram. But the caste just refers to varna. Without the ashrams, which is not signified in the normal usage of caste system, without ashram, you sort of lose the safeguard, the way it was meant to work. If you take one, really a dual system that needs to coexist, if you just take one half of it out, what you're left with is something that will never accomplish its purpose. It becomes handicapped, quite literally, and it has been handicapped. I mean, the root of the caste system, the varnas, have existed in the Vedic literature from the beginning of the Vedas. I mean, it's in the Rig Veda. But over time, what we've seen historically is that it becomes more and more corrupted and sort of reified, made concrete, made stagnant, made something that it's really hard for people to get out of. Whereas never meant that way. Krishna makes it really clear in the Gita. It's according to guna and karma, not according to janma. It's not according to birth that these castes are supposed to exist. There are instances in the Upanishads of people, as well as throughout sort of the earlier history, as opposed to modern history of the Varnas. There are instances of people from different castes sort of, moving around and changing. They're taking on teachers, a Shudra boy taking on a Brahmin teacher as their teacher and changing their Varna in that way. So that has been available, but less and less over time because of the ways in which caste was used for political purposes. Caste was used, specifically Brahmins and Kshatriyas were sort of deployed by rulers, by eventually the British, in a way such that it reinforced all the problems with the system, and sort of allow that flexible sort of nature that is more apparent in the earlier texts. I think as practitioners of bhakti, of yoga, of Krishna consciousness, it's important for us to recognize that there is a really terrible history of oppression related to the caste system. But then there's the reason for that is because it was sort of handicapped almost for 1,000 years or more because of taking that ashram out of the varnashram system, taking that idea of spiritual goals and spiritual progress outside of the system in order to just make it purely a means of obtaining power and wealth.
As the end in and of itself.
Exactly.
Yeah, well said. Maybe a good time to turn it over to the monk, who's situated in an ashram that's quite rare for most people. Even on the Western spectrum of what's possible, it's not even on most people's radar to have that opportunity to simply live a monastic life and give your offering, your dharma, so to speak, in your case, Prem Kirtan, your music, to be able to give that without worrying about much else. What has that ashram component done for you? And what do you think it could do for others in terms of helping them express who they are from the side of dharma that we've been discussing tonight?
That's interesting. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Premananda Prabhu, for your words. I really appreciate what you're saying there. Yeah, on this point, I think it's valuable for anyone and everyone to take a time out of their life, to give themselves fully to God and personal development, in the way we understand what, a full-time experience can afford one. So I think that, depending on, I think the big question is how long should that be for this, like often the thing, and how should one prepare maybe amidst that period. I'm finding now, realistically though, that it's becoming more and more difficult even to have that healthy infrastructure for people to get into. I don't even have the capacity to facilitate what I was given, say 10 years ago, to people that I am, connecting to and cultivating now. So it is challenging. But I have seen that when I look at people who have had the most sustainable and solid Krishna conscious careers over decades, many of them have had a very devout period of life that they maybe not in terms of long time, but an intense period of time that they gave to a period in the temple, for example, or even if it's not so renounced, but at least making that the priority of one's life. I know that in the Mormon tradition, even in my some of the Christian friends that I had from school, they also had the aspect of missionary work that took place after studies, or something that they would do before, embarking on their material lives, completely. And I think that other traditions have recognized the value in that as well. So I think it's valuable. I think that it should also be done with guidance. I don't think it should be run into. I don't think everybody should just seek shelter in the temple automatically. But I can say that it can give one a solid career in Krishna consciousness, that one can have that baseline of how to, approach many of the things. Because if you look, what you're supposed to learn there is you're supposed to get a great exposure and habits into cultivating the essence of the process, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, but also if you can't expect yourself to manage a family or a business or a company if you can't manage your own mind and senses. So I think that ashram life in that sense gives you that opportunity, and if it's done properly, one can graduate from that, in a healthy way to be materially prosperous. In my opinion, I do think though right now as a society we may be struggling with how that process is supposed to go and how much we can facilitate people's growth. Because even for myself, I don't think that if I stayed at a temple alone, I would have had the opportunity to fully express, certain levels of creative and musical potential. But having been connected to a person that took me down, that allowed that further. So I just want to say that, there's a lot of technicalities in that, but the principle I think is valuable. I still recommend it for others, but I'm very wary of what is realistically possible for people, and sometimes we just have to know, how long that also can be.
It's a profound point. You're speaking to the kind of natural check that is meant to be baked into everyone's experience individually within a society, that experience in intense spiritual connection automatically kind of immunizes you from getting confused that material life in any way can give me the highest success, right? The highest goal is money, the highest goal is wealth, fame. When you've really tasted your connection with Krishna, then you can't get so intoxicated and twisted in that way. And the ashram system is meant to facilitate that, for one, not only if you're a monk, but even as a married person, et cetera, et cetera. The whole thing is a kind of gradual development into an absorbed experience of that connection with God. And so it always keeps the material experience in its subordinated place. And then these kind of power plays that we were hearing Premananda Vilas speak to, they're not as easy to put on the common people from, the so-called powers that be, when the common people have had that taste of the higher thing. They're really wonderful. Harivilasa Prabhu, what's your take on this tension of the caste system, how that structure almost naturally seems to play into the hands of unscrupulous people, especially these days, and yet we seem to need some kind of structure also?
Well, I think, when looking at the caste system, if you look at the whole traditional world, then you see, everybody had something similar. So that's the first thing. It's not like it's so unique. It's like everywhere society was very rigid. You look at European feudal society, God was rigid, it was like there's not much social mobility, either left or right or up or center. So it is, the ancient world was generally much more rigid. Now, I think one has to be careful when you look at it. That's what we're basically seeing, is that there's the principle and then there's the application. The whole principle behind the idea was that people have some functional design, and that there's a functional constraint put on what you're supposed to do in the world. Now, if you think that you can determine it based on birth, that was an issue. In terms of the oppression that happened, well, we see that society is always vulnerable to oppression. Even in the absence of the caste system, you think that is somehow, now the oppression is monetary. Like now, okay, people can technically do what they want to, but if you don't have money in the modern world, then you're stuck. Like it's the same, you're stuck.
The only currency, yeah.
You're not officially stuck in some kind of designated caste, like a bureaucratically determined position. But don't tell me practically that, okay, if you dream it, I can come to your high school and tell you, you can dream it, you can do it. But, if you don't have any money, and if you don't have any opportunities, then what practically is the difference? So that's the one thing, to understand that oppression, society is always vulnerable to oppression. Because, see, this is the reality. We see even Premananda Kirtan was speaking, and he was saying that the other side is also true. The fact that he had the opportunity to live as a monk, it was facilitated by other people. So the reality is we all have to be facilitated. Other people have to make it possible for us. If I think me and Premananda Kirtan, we shared a lot of our monastic experience together in the same place. And that thing was built by one guy. Like one guy basically dedicated his life for 5 or 6 or 7 years to facilitating the monastic experience of other people. And that's why we had the experience. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed. So that's just the reality, that this dependent nature, we are dependent on someone else. And that dependency also facilitate, that dependent structure makes, that is the boiling pot either for exploitation or for great elevation. That fact that we are so dependent, it means you will either be exploited or you will be greatly lifted up to a higher position. But we see it's very simple. My Prabhupada also points out in the literature, we see where did it happen? Where exactly where did that shift come? It's very unclear, actually. You know, at which it's not like you can put a specific date on it, but we see that the principle. It is what I find very interesting in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is one of our famous literatures, the Bhagavad Purana. Therein it is explained how the modern world, the age of Kali, as they say, the period in which there is great social decay and degradation, there is a period that is marked. Srila Prabhupada marked it as the period where the caste system was destroyed. And what is that system? He said, not the caste system, but the Varnashram system. The Varnashram system was vitiated. He said it was the point where the Brahmin boy, a young Brahmin boy, cursed the king, even though the king was, in one sense, innocent. And Prabhupada said the genesis for the destruction of the Varnashram society was the hatred that the higher classes started to show for the lower classes. And that principle is not just Varnashram that you see anywhere. Wherever there is hatred from the privileged classes to the unprivileged classes, there will be an issue. And what is fascinating is that it degrades both. It leads to oppression, and also what happens is that it leads to the higher classes themselves not being able to fulfill their function, which is what? Which is to facilitate the experience of everyone else. Wherever you are situated in hierarchy, whether it's in the whole society or in a temple, wherever you are situated, if you have to be able to facilitate the experience of others. And in one sense, we see that our whole society, at least all members of the Krishna consciousness movement, and in one sense, that was also the stated purpose of the society, is to give some people the opportunity to come and have the experience of having the opportunity to be a brahmana, to be a real spiritual intellectual, or to have the opportunity to learn what it means to be a leader or an administrator according to spiritual principles. And but we see that throughout history, that society, it always, like Premananda Vilas was making the point about the organic metaphor that's used, the idea that it's the social body. And we see that societies, they grow old and they die. And then they have to be reborn again. And we see that again and again happening in history, that there is just this tendency of societies to fossilize, become constricted, and then become exploitative. And then what will happen is they die. And then someone else comes to sort of, again, rebirth. And the start of that idea, if we look for, even at a national level, we see nations that achieved great success politically worldwide. You see that what happened is there was, at a certain point, you will see that there was a great push from those who were in positions of privilege to somehow uplift those who are not. That's sort of the thing that pulls the society together. And then you see, then they can push, then they can do something. And that principle is what sort of, that's the only way to harmonize. So, and I think this is a final point. We see that Varnashram as it exists, it can only facilitate people who are sort of purifying their desires by spiritual practice. It's just like the Ayurvedic medicine. It works for people who are, to one sense, living a kind of a sattvic lifestyle.
Clean life.
Otherwise, Ayurvedic medicine it's not going to help you with hardcore cancer, or like it can't solve it because it's just too strong. So similarly, certain kind of very strong desires, very exploitative desires, then these like things like monarchy or Varnashram institutions, they are meant for people that are spiritually a little bit more elevated. Otherwise, the systems they are vulnerable to be, in one sense, corrupted. And there, if we look at that, as we said in our first podcast also, that's the benefit of something like democracy. It can take a beating, even if horrible exploitative leader, he will be restricted by how much damage he can do. So
Yeah.
therefore, an ashram is just it is in that sense, that's its weakness. If people come in who are charlatans, who charade as being brahmanas or kshatriyas without the actual spiritual qualities, then that system is very vulnerable to be misused for exploitation. But it doesn't mean the system is broken. It means that we have to take that step back to see that the system itself says, if unqualified people take positions, then it will be a disaster. It's clear in the scripture was that they acknowledge the fact that this is the danger that you have to be careful about. And I think if we look at history, we saw that's just what happened. People without the qualities that are required of those positions, they took that positions and then greatly misused it.
Can I add something here, David?
Yeah, please do, please.
Harivilasa, I loved your point about, Prabhupada identifying that moment of the degradation of Kali and the destruction of the Varnashram system when the higher castes began to have contempt for the lower classes. Because this is exactly how a lot of sort of scholars have identified the uniqueness of the oppression of the caste system. They say the uniqueness of it isn't just that they're people that are being oppressed, it's that the people that are being oppressed are considered like almost ontologically less than. They're considered impure by definition, and that totally disregards all the statements in the Gita, for instance, where it says, a seer of the truth sees the Brahmana and the elephant and the dog eater as the same spirit soul as Atman. It totally disregards this larger vision and begins to ascribe like a sense of less value to certain people than others, which I think is really and it's totally antithetical to the larger spiritual message of our texts and of our tradition.
You have a really wonderful segue there, because we have an insightful question here from Bhakti Lada I'd like to bring up. She's saying Shudras are often referenced in texts as being less. So the Shudra in the Varnashram system, they're like the legs, they're the workers. How does one honestly embrace one's nature as a Shudra if there's so much judgment, even in scripture? And then she quotes from the Bhagavatam, engaging in the service of low-grade persons is called swavritti, the profession of the dogs. Specifically, Brahmanas and Kshatriyas should not engage in the low and abominable services of Shudras. So it's a real pain point, I would say. Maybe we can take the comment down now. I want to see Harivilasa Prabhu's. Yeah, there we go. These two handsome men's face. The difficulty there, and I'll share from my own experience actually, because I often think about this in relationship to my father, who was one of the people in my life that really spurned my intellectual curiosity, really spurned my sense of finding out the answers to deeper questions in life. And he was himself a brick mason, as I mentioned earlier. And so that's from the Varnashram perspective, a Shudra's position, just a simple laborer. And yet he was one of those people who gave me my sense of potential, which eventually grew into God consciousness and my pursuit for Krishna. And I saw at one point in my dad's life, he was encouraged to take on his own business, to run his own business. And he was a brick mason, excellent. And so people are like, well, you'll make more money and you'll get to set your own time and schedule, et cetera, run your own business. And that period of life when he was doing that was one of the hardest for my whole family, because it just wasn't natural for him. He's an excellent brick mason and he can make arches and, works of art practically. But when it came to hiring people and finding his own jobs and figuring out what to charge and all of the elements that go into running a business, aside from just doing the specific service that business is set up to offer, those things were difficult for him to take on and consider. And then that created a lot of stress and tension at home for his own family, not just for himself. It was felt by all of us. And I think that's the point of harmony here for when we consider where is somebody in the class of their work. We also have to look at what is their motivation and inspiration internally. Because when my dad would come home and sit and talk to me about philosophy and politics and God, he did that when he was behaving as a Shudra. Whereas when he tried to enter into that Vaishya realm from the external side, he had no time or energy to do that with me afterwards. And so a healthy expression of the Varnashram system, I feel, gives that sense of potential for people to be satisfied in their day-to-day experience. And then from there, in that place of material satisfaction, have a vision towards Krishna. But I'll bring the question out now to everybody else. I think this might be a nice place, a practical place for us to close out the conversation. How do we reconcile these kind of apparent valuations of people based on their work with these spiritual principles? Not everybody at once.
Well, one thing I can point out, I read an interesting conversation once with Srila Prabhupada, and you were asking him, what is the purpose of an ashram if everybody is the Vaishnava? So this specifically now in devotional societies, we're all spiritual, we all acknowledge our spiritual identity, and we're in one sense also practicing that, like everyone, at least in our community, our society, we're all committed to a certain extent to certain high-level activities, like chanting mantras every day and, attending temple functions. Which is then, it's considered transcendental. So then he said, well, in an ideal society, even if everybody is spiritual, he said it is like acting in a play. It's like you come together, you say, okay, who will act as the manager? And who will act as this, and who will act as that? And then your roles are decided according to your costume. You already have a costume, and then, okay, this is the props I have, and then you play act in one sense. But beneath it, there's this understanding, at least in an enlightened society, that this is not the total identity. So sometimes when we see these heavy statements, it is actually referring, so oftentimes, that is the result what you get also when you have people that have no spiritual consciousness. I've met people like that, is it? We've all met we know that is such a thing as low-grade persons. People who have zero interest in spirituality. They're busy with very heavy occupations. Like some of my friends from school, butchers. He's a butcher, and that's what he does. He kills things and he drinks, and that's about what he does. So Bhagavatam, sometimes language is scathing, but that is the reality. That without that enlightened core beneath it, the occupations can degrade. It is a fact, and people can become very hard, very materialistic, and also very dull, and not necessarily dull intelligence-wise, but just dull in their understanding of higher values. So sometimes these heavy statements that you see, exactly what it is. But you also have to see, but it's not just directed towards the Sudras. There's so many heavy statements on the Kshatriyas also. Basically calling out the Kshatriyas who are just misusing their power, drinking a lot, and the danger of killing so much, performing all these sacrifices. So the Bhagavatam is interesting that it is equal in terms of tuning everyone. It calls everyone out, basically. And the point that it's trying to make is that the moment that spiritual core is released, even Brahmanas will be called out. Dull-headed Brahmanas who cannot understand the ultimate goal of life and think that the purpose of life is just to perform ritualistic activities. So the Bhagavatam calls everyone out that is not having that core connection of true Krishna consciousness. Because in that sense, even as we see, even in an ashram society that's perfectly functioning, quote unquote, from an external level, actually everybody will be degraded by the performance of the occupation. And that is something that has to be very clearly understood and very perspective. There is no such thing as being able to run a truly secular society in the sense of a society in which God plays no role. So there's a difference between the separation between church and state. That's one thing, and even that can be argued in the Vedic system also. Maybe a discussion in a future episode that we see how there is an element of secularity actually in a true Vedic culture as well. But I'm speaking about a godless society, as Prabhupada calls it, a society which doesn't acknowledge the soul, doesn't acknowledge God. It will be impossible. People will be degraded by whatever occupation they perform, because it is only that core of spirituality that burns up the inherent impurity that is saturated within every single occupation in this world. Every occupation has some smoke that it will create, and you can only purify it by transcendence. So at least that's how I look at these heavy statements of the Bhakti scripture, that it is pointing towards those individuals who are taking shelter of occupation without any spiritual consciousness. And then the Bhagavatam is just making the prediction and calling out that is not going to end well for anyone.
Yeah, I think also the Bhagavatam is speaking to archetypes. These Varnas are archetypes. And if I look at my dad's coworkers, they were not the most high-minded people. They were very simple people who, they went to the bar after they got off from work. Even though they had families to go home to, they spent a few hours at the bar and then they went home in the state that you go home after you've been at the bar. So my dad was exceptional in that way, also amongst his Shudra community, so to speak. And that's just another reflection. That's the healthy expression of the situation, is that innocent until proven guilty, maybe guilty until proven innocent, that you have a certain sense of responsibility or lack of a sense of responsibility. And if you rise above that, then you should be treated above that. But there's a kind of safe deference to the lower nature when talking about society for the sake of protection of others. Premananda Kirtan or Premananda Vilas, your thoughts on these touchy subjects?
Did you want to go first?
No, I'd love to hear what Premananda has to say.
Sure. I think I have two responses to this. One is, I think, close to what you were saying, Deva. We can't paint all Shudras with one brush. An architect can be a Shudra, as well as a butcher, as well as someone who sells drugs, right? There can be so many different kinds, just as there can be really amazing leaders and really terrible leaders. And so I think those more extreme statements are talking about some extreme cases. Personally, that's my thinking on them. Especially like the comment is interesting because it talks about the profession of dogs. I feel like that is a class within Shudra that is especially maligned, because clearly not all Shudras are performing the profession of dogs, which presumably means, very unclean. But my second thought, I think, is the more important one, which is the whole point of the Bhakti tradition, the whole point of the Vedic texts. Ultimately, the highest vision is to transcend Varnashram, is to move beyond these distinctions and divisions and concerns, frankly, with matter and material life, to the realm of spirit. And that movement holds the highest primacy. And we see in the lives of the saints and teachers in our tradition that they made no consideration of Varna when accepting students, when elevating students to high positions. We have, Haridas Thakur, who was an outcast, not even a Shudra, was embraced as the teacher par excellence of chanting the names of Krishna. We have an instance in the Chaitanya Charitamrita of, it was Ishwara Puri, who accepted a Shudra boy as his servant and was questioned by Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, why are you accepting a Shudra? And the answer was without any kind of caveat, very clear, unmistakable, that creed and caste, these things have nothing to do with one's spiritual life and ultimate success. I think that's what I take away or think about when I'm confronted with these statements.
Yeah, really valuable to be reminded of, again, that natural check in the society that's essentially, that each of you have spoken to it in your own way now, that when the real goal is kept as a connection with Krishna, then these potential degradations or deprivations within the social structure are kept at a minimum. They're prevented automatically when that healthy sense of potential in a relationship with Krishna is everybody's focus. And when that's not the focus, then all this depravity gets to come in. Premananda Kirtan Prabhu, would you close us out?
Sure. Well, I'm really grateful for hearing all of you speak on this point. It's amazing, and I myself am feeling enlightened by hearing it. I on a practical note and moving in terms of an action point for how I can make sense of it, is understanding that we just have to make the best of a bad bargain, and ultimately we're in the situation in the material world, and our main responsibility is to make a plan to go back to Godhead, and keeping that long-term goal over the sustained period of one's life. and all the phases of life is something that is our responsibility. And although we may not be able to fully implement brahmachari, grihastha, banapras, sannyasi, but we may be able to see, different phases that we will be passing through to a point where we can have more and more opportunity to be, to have that aspect of Krishna consciousness just be completely the majority of our day. And I can only look to living, the examples of our acharyas, and particularly in the life of Srila Prabhupada, who was given this amazing instruction, to share Krishna consciousness with the whole world in the early 1920s. But at the same time, Prabhupada, he wasn't in the position where he could fully, manifest that desire. It was actually 40 years later, where he then, he took that step, the big step of, let's say, getting on a ship and coming here. But even after that, there was so much that had to happen before ISKCON was established. But then, within those 12 years, it was something, really exceptional. And I think that just seeing life from that broader perspective, and seeing how we can prepare for these things in different ways, understanding that our circumstances, as many of you had pointed out before, is sometimes karmically, just set, and I don't think we have to be defined by our vocation if it's a shudrafied vocation by traditional definition. But if we're being able to execute the fundamentals of our spiritual practice and look after our families with the preparation that the last few years of my life are going to be very different than these years, I think that that's a success, in that endeavor. And I just want to add on a visionary level, is to try and create these necessary infrastructures for the generations to come, whereby they're not challenged as much as we are. Because what we find is, let's say we come to spiritual life after 18 years or 20 years or 12 years of education, it becomes very difficult once you're locked into the system. If you're at the age of 30 and now you want to consider living on a farm or simple living, higher thinking kind of life, it's actually very hard to make those transitions. So I think that there is a responsibility of one generation to prepare for the next. And maybe we ourselves are not going to have the good fortune of everybody having a vocation as a traveling musician that can necessarily make lots of money and be famous and serve God and people in so many ways. But we can be preparing the grounds for many other people in different capacities. And I think that seeing it from that perspective of this entire lifetime, and I think really helps understanding how these things are at play here. And that's just one of the things that came to my mind in terms of the preparation of what Krishna consciousness is, and what Varnashram really means in principle, preparing us from one phase to the next. And I think that will be relevant to people in different times and places and circumstances.
I love that as a closing point, because we're so far from the ideal. It can feel frustrating. What's the point, right? Just abandon any idea that we can do anything. And you remind me of something. I'm going to paraphrase a Chinese proverb that I heard, which is that culture means planting a tree that you won't live to see the shade of. That down the road, people will benefit from my actions right now. And in that, I can take satisfaction. I'm here in Detroit, Michigan. So sometimes in speaking to my own community about this idea, I say, I'm not ever going to live in a self-sufficient farm community. If that's why any of you are here, then leave, because that's not what we're here to create.
Yeah.
I'm trying to create an atmosphere where our children's children can think about doing that in an honest and healthy way, not running away from their own life experience, but because it's the natural step in their own life experience that they can be in that kind of ideal circumstance by dint of our effort and the effort of generations before them. So thank you. That's a very hopeful way to conclude. Thank you, dear devotees. We went a little long tonight, but it's with special guests and a special topic. I think we could keep going another hour, but it just means we have to have you guys back on. So thank you again, Hari Premananda Kirtan Prabhu and Premananda Vilas and Harivilasa, all for joining again on the Polis. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Hopefully you've been noticing that here on Bodhika, there's a lot of wonderful things happening, so please stay tuned. We're just trying to bring these down-to-earth conversations with the wonderful and diverse Bhakti community to the rest of the world. So thank you all for contributing to that this evening. Hare Krishna.